We are not talking about Women's Day issues today, but actually climate change resilience and adaptation. And our recent report on improving climate change resilience. How are member states doing on adaptation? So first of all, welcome to Angelica and Wouter, who have been working on this area at the EEA. Can you briefly explain the EEA's role in assessing effective climate change adaptation?
Yes, of course. So I would say that we have been working on the issue for several years now. We have a work stream on assessing, evaluating, and monitoring and evaluating national adaptation strategies and plans. But right now we have two pieces of legislation: the governance regulation and the climate law, giving stronger mandates to look into this type of assessment.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. And before I go on, I forgot to mention that if you have questions or comments for experts, they're very happy to take them and address them and answer them for you today. So if you have questions, please jot them down in the comment section and we will get to them as soon as we can. Thank you, Angelica, for the brief introduction. But what do we mean exactly by adaptation measures and actions? Can we explain a little bit about it?
I think with adaptation measures, we mean a whole set of different activities that are taken not only by national authorities, but also by regions, by local governments, even by private companies and individuals that help us to deal with the impacts that we foresee from climate change. And there can be many things. There can be changing legislation, or there can be economic measures like promoting certain investments to make your house more adapted, or to build infrastructure. So it's really a wide range of measures. And one of the characteristics is that it's always context specific. You cannot say it needs to be all of this or all of that. No, it needs to be targeted to the specific location, the specific sector, and the specific context.
Mm-hmm. How does this relate to improving resilience?
Well, improving resilience and strengthening our adaptive capacity is one of the things that we have to do to deal with future consequences. And many of the measures that we are talking about today, and many of the things that we get in the reporting from member states, are not exactly what is happening at household level or what is happening at very local level, but it's more how you can facilitate or enable those things. If you want to have parks that can also deal with heavy rainfall and so on, do you have the right pieces of legislation in place to make those things happen? So we're not talking today about how do you really adapt your house or how do you adapt your company. It's more about the enabling measures that are taken by national and regional authorities.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's good. Important thing to note. And now it's a good segue into talking about the report, Angelica, with you in a sec. We released it was a first review, I take it, of progress EU member states are making in national adaptation measures for 2021. Can you explain a bit what the report found?
Yes, of course, but maybe just to briefly complement on
Yeah.
the climate resilience first. Also, documents like the European Adaptation Strategy or the European Climate Law paved the pathway towards climate resilience, and there is a big ambition to reach that by 2050. So we will need to take action. And so we have been looking at the reported information. Those are official government reports provided under the governance regulation, and we try to paint this kind of European picture of where we are in terms of adaptation in Europe. And we have found, for example, that all the EU member states have adaptation policy frameworks ready. They are strong, and basically we have two types of those frameworks. Many of them are legally non-binding and have a strategic character, but many of the EU member states are already shifting towards something legally more binding and kind of anchoring the objectives in forms of national laws.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe in addition to that, and what makes this different from the work we did in the past, is that for the first time, the 2021 reporting was having a big focus not only on the planning stage, which remains very important, but also on the implementation stage and how countries are dealing with monitoring and with the evaluation of all those plans and updating them and so on. So in that sense, this was the the largest data collection and adaptation we had, because it was focusing on the whole policy cycle rather than what was happening in the past, mainly on that planning stage.
Mm-hmm. Angelica, was it? Were we able to find out how we were doing? We collectively, as European member states and the EU as a whole, how we're doing on the whole adaptation?
We are doing better and better, I would say. What's clear from the information and from the assessment is that adaptation action is taken by the member states. We can clearly see that from the robust information reported. Of course, we try to build a report also on the previous work done by the member states, done by the European Commission and by the EEA, and complemented it with this information, and we also aim to continue in the future. But in terms of this European picture, we see the clear shift from planning towards implementation. Of course, what we can see from the reported information is this kind of like the high-level enabling factors prepared at the national level, but those are kind of the frameworks boosting implementation at the regional and at the local levels. Mm-hmm. So we are clearly shifting towards implementation.
And sort of the actions that we're talking about, do we see in this sort of data? Yes, city X or whatever, Paris is building a green space here, or this and that. Is that sort of detail that we're talking about, or?
Not really. I think what we're really talking about here is that, for example, are all the measures in place to make sure that cities can take these kind of actions more easily in the future? Is everything in place to make sure that adaptation is no longer managed solely by a ministry or an agency or a unit responsible for it, but that it's also mainstream to other sectors? So is not only transport and agriculture and all those things measured in the adaptation plans, but is it also adaptation measured in your transport plan, in your agriculture plan, and then executed towards these sectoral initiatives?
And that's an important point, because streamlining it in all policy areas is so vital to make sure that we do adaptation right. Is that?
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's probably the only way forward.
Yes.
Yeah.
We have been also looking at aspects of mainstreaming and horizontal and vertical coordination.
Yeah.
And how that is happening.
Yeah. And you mentioned this is the first review. So where do we go? Where does the EEA go from here with this type of reporting?
Well, I would refer back here to the regulation we have right now, the governance regulation on the energy union and climate action. Mm-hmm. So it sets up biannual reporting on national adaptation actions, which means that this type of information will come to the agency in every second year, and therefore we will be looking at it in every second year. We have a reporting year this year, 2023. So very soon, as the information is in, we will start looking at it and basically preparing an EEA briefing, updating the key messages and seeing what kind of progress was made in the last 2 years.
Yeah. Which is rather important information. I mean, how can this help? How can this type of reporting help?
I think it helps in multiple ways. One of the things that is still very important is although it's very context specific, and a country in the Nordic and a country in the Mediterranean are having a different context and different needs, there's a lot of mutual learning possibilities that are there. And that's also one of the reasons why we ask not just to provide us with some text, with some paragraphs, but also with a lot of links of how you are dealing with it, how you're doing it at national level, which kind of platforms you have, what kind of information, what kind of scenarios you use, what kind of good practices you have, how do you deal with your population, with people at local level, how you deal with different sectors or with vulnerable groups or whatever. So that mutual learning and still capacity building is probably the biggest one that we are doing. And the questions in the reporting are aimed at providing always a little bit of additional information that we then can compare with the previous one, although it's text fields. So we're mainly not talking about numbers we need to compare, so no percentages that we can put on that. It's mainly based on text fields.
Okay, thanks. Again, if you have any questions or comments for our experts today, please feel free to jot them down in the comment section, and we'll make sure we get them to answer them. So Walter, is there any link between areas that have suffered more extreme weather events an adaptation measure progress? Have we seen sort of, for instance, is Spain ahead of others, for instance, because they're experiencing greater impacts?
I think that's difficult to say so clearly. But of course, what you see is that, unfortunately, those extreme weather events, they help in awareness raising and making clear to people that adaptation is not something for the generations to come, but is something we're dealing with today. At the other hand, one of the pitfalls we may not step in is that adaptation is only about these extreme weather events. There's also shift in average temperatures, there's sea level rise, ocean acidification, and all these slow onset events, and also for them you need to adapt. But extreme weather events certainly help when it comes to awareness raising and making clear to people this is a reality, adapt to it.
They certainly impact our daily lives, whereas, as you said, slower events like water, sea level rises, you might notice it once in a while, but it doesn't impact your daily life as such. So again, that's something to consider. All of this work is happening at government level, but to what extent are citizens impacted by this reporting? How do they see these actions taking place?
Well, here I would say that subnational adaptation, so adaptation action at the regional and local level, is really the backbone of implementation. We have already mentioned the enabling factors like the national level policy frameworks, which are there to boost this implementation, but the real implementation that needs to happen at the lower levels of governance levels. So I would say there is a gradual shift, and citizens should be able to see that because all the measures will be implemented at their level of governance. And what we have also seen from the reported information, what is of course not going into details on what kind of actions are done by cities, but it refers back to these levels. We have seen also very different approaches. I would like to flag here the very specific national circumstances, and that's really interesting in adaptation because how the setup is created in a country that really reflects on the national specificities.
Yeah.
Some countries reported that they adopted regional adaptation action plans or strategies. Some other countries have separate streams of financing or supporting this kind of action. Some countries rely on the Covenant of Mayor initiatives, which can help to take cities, towns, and municipalities on board. So there are many ways how to make this happen, and it will happen gradually.
Yeah. It's a huge undertaking. I mean, both in resources, financial, but also mentality and changing behaviors in some cases, isn't it? Absolutely, and it is something that started and that is going on everywhere. However, if it comes to the conclusions that are not so clear from the report, or the conclusions that are not so very positive, is that it remains very difficult to get an idea about those financial resources and how much is spent on adaptation. Partly that has to do with the fact that it's not one centralized organization responsible for it, but it needs to be mainstreamed. But also, there are a lot of other initiatives that need to be taken, and on top of that, you need to make them ready for the future and prepare them for the future. So those financial information, although it's part of the reporting, is probably one of the weaker parts so far, where we then for next cycles try to give some guidance to countries from, look, this is an example of how someone did it, focusing on research projects or focusing on something else. This is the kind of information that you might put in here, but it's certainly one of the weaker parts, the financial one. Okay, great. We have a question from Firat. Thanks to this, I would like to ask, how can we see what my city or region is doing to adapt? What plans are for the future, and what about now?
It's of course a little bit depending which city that is, because there are many initiatives. Angelica mentioned like a minute ago the Covenant of Mayors, and there are a lot of local authorities who subscribe to that. But maybe one step back, because we cannot say exactly you find your information there or there. Maybe a starting point can be your country profile. So all the reporting is structured into country profiles on Climate Adapt, our website, our platform on climate change adaptation, where we put that. And I said before, we don't only want to have paragraphs of text of what you're doing, but also a collection of what are the most important links in your countries. And certainly this is one of them. If you have these kind of platforms, if you have these regional or even local initiatives, but next to the Covenant of Mayors, which is the most known one, there are other ones as well. And if a lot of big cities or regions are subscribed to them, most likely you will find it in your country overview. C40 cities, just to give one other example, is also a possibility.
Perhaps just we'll give the link to Climate Adapt. What else can we find there? There's also examples of good adaptation measures, right, in actions.
I would say Climate Adapt is a really, really robust, not just a web page, but a platform where you can find verified and reliable information on adaptation. So even if you are engaging with adaptation action as an expert or as a specialist or as a citizen, or you are just curious to see what others are doing, what is possible to do, you can find all the type of information there. The country profiles are created directly from the reporting, but you can find their case studies, good practices. You can find their methodological tools. You can find their quite many contacts to, for example, other municipalities, to the member countries, if you want to reach out, because that's also, for example, part of the reporting. So I would say it's really comprehensive. For the first time, it might be also slightly overwhelming because it's just so robust and you can find so many things there. I would really advise to go there. And also countries very often refer to their national adaptation knowledge platforms in their reporting, and that's also a good place to start with looking at information on your country.
Okay, thanks. Again, if you have questions or comments, please don't hesitate to come forward now to ask them, and we'll make sure the experts see them. We have a second question from Raphael. Speaking about the implementation, what would you recommend if the regional adaptations aren't implemented fast enough? How could businesses and social society help to improve that?
It's a term that comes back more and more often, and I think that has to do with the fact that everybody realizes that time is running out to some extent and we need to act now. If you look at the new EU adaptation strategy, it exactly talks about faster, smarter and more systemic adaptation within the EU. It also talks about more international initiatives globally, but those three, faster, smarter and more systemic, are really taking place there. Another one that comes back all the time is that indeed local authorities, regional authorities, national authorities cannot do it on their own, because you cannot pinpoint and say this is an important sector to adapt, this is an important sector to adapt. In fact, the whole society needs to adapt, and therefore it will need private sector initiative or public-private partnerships and all these kind of things. Now, it's very difficult to say this region is not adapting fast enough or this country is not adapting fast enough, because of course we also want to avoid maladaptation, and things that look good at first glance may have negative impacts on climate change mitigation and our CO2 emissions as an obvious one, but also think about water management, biodiversity, pollution, our circular economy. So we also need to make sure that the actions that are taken are robust not only at first glance, but also looking at the other climate and environmental objectives we have.
Yeah, indeed.
Also, I would just complement briefly that adaptation is a medium and long-term action usually. So even if something has been implemented, you might not be able to see the immediate effect, and it's very hard to assess in a very short time what the effect was. So sometimes it also needs time before we can be sure about the success of implementation. And of course, if you still have the feeling that things are not happening fast enough, as Walter mentioned, that there are many ways how to get engaged. Citizen action is definitely important. We see that many initiatives are bringing this topic to discussion for us. Of course, the private sector is gradually engaging more and more, and there are also other initiatives from the European level, that, like the mission on adaptation, trying to really boost implementation and action at the regional and local level, even at community level.
That's probably that is one of the main reasons why at Climate Adapt we don't want to have the biggest collection of case studies, but it's a collection of case studies where a lot of energy is invested to go back to them after a while, after 2 years, after 3 years, whatever. But going back to these case studies at regular time, not just to see what were your plans and did you implement them, but also afterwards, were the effects now really what you had foreseen in your plan? Did you have to adapt something in your adaptation measures along the way? So in that sense, it's not the biggest collection of adaptation measures, but we try to maintain them and really follow up afterwards to have that long-term perspective.
Okay, good. Another question from Noelia. Hello, what kind of time delay can we expect between adaptation actions and real improvements on the ground? We touched a little bit on that. I mean, building a green space from scratch will take some time, or blue space. I mean, it's a lot of investment and so forth.
I would say it really depends on. It's almost like a scientific question. I would say where you really need to be sure what kind of measure you need to assess. And as you mentioned, if we are building up a green space from scratch, it can take, 10, 15 years until it gets fully functional if we count with tree coverage there.
Yeah.
If you are building infrastructure, you have big infrastructure projects where you are actually implementing adaptation measures on highways or like railway corridors.
Yeah.
That can be even decades, because those are really like long-term investments where of course we need to be sure that they are climate resilient, they are climate proofed, but it still takes time to build them. So it's measure specific.
Measure specific, indeed.
Yeah, of course, for some of the other categories that are not infrastructure, like for example, campaigns on behavioral change and so on, of course, it's always advised that you evaluate them simply to learn from them. And if you do something like these kind of measures, or an economic measure where you say, okay, I will promote this kind of investment and I will de-promote another kind, then you of course regularly evaluate what you're happening and stop what is not functioning or adapt it further. But especially for infrastructure, which is the most visible one for most people when it comes to adaptation, timelines are pretty long.
Or maybe just to bring in two other examples from agriculture and forestry. So in agriculture, you can relatively swiftly change the type of the crops. It can be indeed a complicated process, but in general rather swift if we compare that with forestry, where you are changing your tree composition and then it takes 100 years to grow up that forest and see if it becomes more climate resilient. So we operate here on like very different timelines.
Okay. We still have some time for more comments or questions, so if you have them, I would ask you to put them in now as time is running out. Perhaps I can go back to the report a little bit and say, what has the reaction been from stakeholders, from member states, and how's the report being used?
The main reaction, of course, that we have is from people who are dealing with those topics, people who are creating strategies and plans, being it at national or at regional level, or need to do that at sector level. And for them, of course, us making that assessment and focusing a lot on examples of good practice that were in mutual learning initiatives, that helps them, of course, to think about their next reporting that is happening this year and to say, okay, good, that's something we are also doing. And what we want by that is that all the initiatives that are happening in a country and the set of information that is reported comes as close as possible to each other. So that is our main community reacting. And then, of course, it also gives a kind of an overview of those areas where potentially more action is needed. You see in the sectors, for example, that almost all countries have items like health, water management, agriculture and forestry. And at the other hand, some other sectors are hardly thought about so far in climate risk assessments, and having them in a simple graph and saying, well, only one country, for example, is looking at how sensitive the ICT infrastructure is, that might be a topic for the future. So these kind of learning each other.
Indeed, the community is rather narrow because we interact a lot with our lead reporters. Countries have people appointed to do the reporting, and of course we have like adaptation communities, experts that we are talking to at the member state level. But maybe I would like to raise also another interesting point, that we are also liaising not just with the EU member states, but with the EEA member countries, and we try to take them on board with their voluntary reporting. So we really have comprehensive information covering all Europe.
And what other countries are we talking about?
Right now we are in touch with Iceland, we are in touch with Switzerland, Turkey already reported in 2021. on a voluntary basis, we are reaching out to Norway.
Yeah, okay, interesting. I have another question from Noelia. We know that climate change impacts will get worse, so do these adaptation actions have to prepare us for the worst case scenarios?
Well, those adaptation actions need to function and do what they are supposed to do in an efficient and effective way for many future scenarios, including those worst case scenarios. So indeed, it's true that for adaptation actions, you don't only look at the ambition levels that we have when it comes to mitigation and make sure that they happen. Of course, that's a major focus and we should strive to them, but you don't limit yourself to a scenario of a maximum plus 2 degree. You also look at, if we don't reach that, unfortunately, what else is the future then bringing, and how can we still have measures that are functioning in that way? For example, if you're looking at a lot of the measures that we believe are one of the most important ones when it comes to nature-based solutions, ecosystem-based adaptation, it is a point of concern. It is something to think about, that they also work if we are living in a world that is much warmer, much weather, much whatever the local climate conditions are. If we don't reach these scenarios we all want. So yeah, it's certainly one of the scenarios to keep in mind is the worst case, but also the other ones.
Yeah, yeah.
And also I would just say that this question really touches upon the essence of adaptation, because we used to say that we are working here with moving targets, because we don't have the full certainty how warmer the world will be.
Yeah.
At certain kind of time horizons. On the other hand, this is why it's also extremely important to mitigate, because with successful mitigation, we won't have to think about the worst case scenario, but of course we have to get prepared for many types of scenarios here.
Yeah, I think we have time for one more question for myself. What are any other countries outside the European area doing something like this, assessing their adaptation? I mean, can this be seen as sort of a standard, a global standard in
Yes,
how we assess and improve adaptation?
Definitely, we are moving towards more comprehensive assessments, and I would just like to give one example from the UNFCCC process, so from the international climate negotiations. It's also published online on their website, and many countries handled in so-called adaptation communications under the Paris Agreement. So also other countries outside of the EU area have started to not only presenting but also looking at the implementation aspect and at the progress aspect of the actions. And those informations are available. Other countries are doing other reportings. All the EU member states report also under the UNFCCC framework. In the national communication, they also mention the adaptation actions.
The climate adapt community, or the people dealing with that, are also in contact with regional platforms from other parts of the world. And there you see indeed that over the last few years only, there's really a shift of looking at those natural hazards and those impact of extreme weather events to make platforms that also include all kinds of measures and solutions and actions to adapt and to deal with that. So of course, the Pacific is different from what we're having here in Europe, but when it comes to awareness raising and that kind of soft measures, there's also an exchange possible there and learning from each other over there. So yeah, it's a global activity, everybody in its own region, because it's so local and context specific, but altogether it's a global action.
Yeah, okay, thanks. I think we will leave it at that for now. For sure, we will come back to climate change adaptation in the months ahead. And we have lots of reports and briefings at the EEA on this issue, very important issue here at the in Europe as well. Thank you for joining us today, and we hope to see you soon again.